Barron Trump's polite request was met with ridicule, but the room froze the moment Melania arrived. The morning sun streamed through the tall glass windows of Pinecrest Financial Bank in downtown San Diego. It was the kind of place where every surface gleamed, and the air was thick with the hum of efficiency. The tellers at their stations were sharply dressed, their conversations clipped and professional as clients filtered in and out with purpose. Just before 10 a.m., the heavy oak doors swung open. A young man, tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit with a crisp white shirt, stepped inside. His polished shoes clicked softly against the marble floor as he walked with quiet confidence toward the front counter. His hair was neatly styled, his posture straight, and his presence commanded attention, though not in the way one might expect. Barron Trump, now a young adult, approached the counter with a slight smile. He carried himself with the kind of calm confidence that could only come from someone used to the spotlight but uninterested in flaunting it. As he reached the counter, he glanced at the nameplate of the teller before him. Sandra H. Good morning. He began politely, his voice steady and respectful. I'd like to open a new account, please. Sandra barely glanced up, giving him the once-over with an expression that landed somewhere between disinterest and skepticism. Do you have an appointment? She asked, her tone clipped. I don't, Barron admitted, his smile unchanging. But I was told I could speak to someone about opening an account. Sandra sighed audibly, tapping her pen against the counter. Her eyes lingered on him, and for a moment, it seemed like she was calculating whether he was worth her time. Behind her, two other employees exchanged knowing glances, one of them muttering something under his breath that made the other stifle a laugh. Barron remained unfazed, though he was clearly aware of the atmosphere shifting around him. Is there someone available who can assist me? He asked calmly. Sandra finally looked him in the eye, and for the first time, her expression carried something resembling disdain. We're quite busy today, she said flatly. Maybe try scheduling an appointment next time. We're not here for drop-ins. Barron blinked, the corners of his mouth tightening just slightly. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, pulling out a sleek leather portfolio. I have all the necessary documents right here, he explained, his voice still polite but with a hint of firmness now. It should only take a few minutes. Sandra barely glanced at the portfolio before letting out a sharp breath. Look, she said, lowering her voice slightly. This isn't the kind of place where you just walk in and expect immediate service. We cater to a certain clientele. There it was, the implied assumption, wrapped in a veneer of professionalism but dripping with judgment. Barron, however, didn't flinch. I understand, he replied, his tone measured. But I believe this is exactly the kind of place I'm looking for. Still, Sandra wasn't budging. She gestured vaguely toward the exit. I think you might be more comfortable at a different branch. Maybe somewhere more accommodating. But what happened next would ensure that everyone in that room would remember this day for a long time. The air in the bank seemed to grow heavier as Sandra's dismissive tone echoed across the quiet lobby. Barron stood there for a moment, his calm demeanor unwavering. His eyes flicked to the other staff members behind the counter, who were now openly whispering and smirking, clearly enjoying the unfolding scene. One of them, a younger man with a name tag reading Kylem, leaned toward Sandra and whispered something under his breath. Whatever it was, it made her lips twitch into a smug smile. Sandra turned back to Barron and tilted her head, as if sizing him up once more. Listen, she said, her voice adopting a patronizing lilt. This isn't the kind of place where we deal with casual walk-ins. Maybe you didn't read the sign properly on your way in. Barron's brows furrowed slightly. I'm sorry, did I miss something? He asked, his voice still calm but with a slight edge of incredulity. Kyle, who had been eavesdropping, suddenly chimed in. "Yeah, buddy," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "This isn't one of those banks where you just show up and think you'll be handed a free checking account. You need to, meet certain qualifications." Barron's gaze shifted to Kyle, his expression neutral but his posture slightly more rigid. "I see," he said, his voice even. "And what qualifications are those?" Kyle shrugged, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin. "Let's just say the kind of people we usually deal with don't walk in without an appointment." Sandra chuckled softly, clearly emboldened by her colleague's words. "Exactly," she added. "We have a certain standard here. It's nothing personal, of course." Barron took a deep breath, glancing around the lobby. The other clients were now subtly watching the interaction. Their curiosity piqued. A few of them exchanged uncomfortable looks, but none stepped in. Barron turned back to Sandra, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. "I understand that you're busy," he said, his tone steady but firm. "But I don't think my request is unreasonable. If there's someone else I can speak to, perhaps a manager, I'd be happy to wait." Sandra's smile faltered for a moment before she regained her composure. "Our manager is unavailable," she said quickly. "And honestly, we don't have time to explain our policies to every walk-in who comes through the door." Kyle chuckled again, and this time, Barron's eyes flashed with something that looked like disappointment rather than anger. He slowly closed his portfolio and slid it back into his jacket. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath as he stood there, looking at Sandra and Kyle as if memorizing their faces. "Thank you for your time," he said finally, his voice low but pointed. Without another word, he turned and began walking toward the exit. But just as the glass doors began to close behind him, the bank's atmosphere shifted in a way no one could have predicted. The glass doors hadn't even swung shut behind Barron when a sleek black SUV pulled up just outside the bank. The vehicle was understated yet undeniably expensive, its presence drawing a few curious glances from passers-by. From the passenger side, Melania Trump stepped out with the kind of effortless grace that immediately commanded attention. Dressed in a tailored cream coat and dark sunglasses, she moved with quiet authority. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement as she made her way to the entrance, her posture regal and her expression calm but resolute. Those near the windows straightened instinctively, their eyes widening as they recognized her. Inside, Sandra was already recounting the interaction with Barron to Kyle, laughing softly as she mimicked his polite tone. "Can you believe he actually thought?" But her words died in her throat as the doors opened again and Melania entered the lobby. The room fell silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and the faint hum of keyboard typing abruptly ceased. Heads turned in unison as Melania removed her sunglasses and scanned the room. Her gaze was direct, unwavering, as she spotted Barron standing just beyond the counter, his back to her. "Barron," she called, her voice clear and composed, cutting through the stunned quiet. He turned, his expression softening slightly as he saw his mother approach. "Mom," he greeted her, his tone measured but carrying a hint of relief. Melania reached his side in a few graceful strides, placing a reassuring hand on his arm before turning her attention to the counter. Her piercing gaze landed on Sandra, who was now visibly flustered, her earlier confidence crumbling under Melania's scrutiny. "Is there a problem here?" Melania asked, her voice calm but firm. The question wasn't directed at Barron. It was clearly meant for Sandra. Sandra stammered, her cheeks flushing as she scrambled for an answer. No, ma'am," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. We just..." Kyle, still seated behind the counter, looked equally uncomfortable. He shifted nervously in his chair, avoiding Melania's gaze as he fumbled with a stack of papers. Melania didn't raise her voice, but the weight of her presence was palpable. "I was under the impression that this bank prides itself on professionalism," she said, her words deliberate. "But from what I've seen, that standard was not extended to my son." Sandra opened her mouth to respond but quickly closed it again, clearly unsure of what to say. The other staff members watched in stunned silence, their earlier smugness now replaced with a mix of embarrassment and fear. Melania took a step closer to the counter, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps you didn't recognize him," she continued, her tone sharper now. "But that is no excuse for treating anyone, especially a potential client, with disrespect." Sandra swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to regain her composure. I didn't realize," she began, her voice trailing off. "No," Melania interjected, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You didn't bother to realize, and that is the issue." But what came next would ensure that Sandra and Kyle would never forget this encounter, or its consequences. The silence in the bank was deafening. Sandra's face had turned a deep shade of red, her earlier smugness replaced with visible discomfort. Kyle, who had been so quick to mock Barron moments ago, now looked like he wanted to sink into his chair and disappear. Even the other employees, who had been whispering and snickering earlier, stood frozen at their stations, their eyes darting nervously between Melania and their colleagues. Melania held their gaze, her expression unflinching. "You represent this institution," she said, her words precise and cutting. "Your behavior reflects not only on yourselves but on the bank as a whole. If you cannot offer basic courtesy and professionalism, perhaps you are in the wrong line of work." Sandra opened her mouth, but no words came out. Kyle shifted awkwardly, glancing around for backup, but none of the other staff dared to intervene. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and every second of silence felt like an eternity. "I would like to speak with the manager," Melania continued, her tone calm but leaving no room for argument. "Now." Sandra hesitated, her hands fumbling with the computer mouse in front of her. "Ma'am, the manager isn't," she started, but Melania's sharp gaze stopped her mid-sentence. "Then I suggest you find them," Melania said coldly. "I will not leave until this is addressed." Reluctantly, Sandra nodded and hurried off toward a door marked Management. The other staff watched her go, their faces a mix of embarrassment and dread. Kyle, meanwhile, busied himself pretending to sort paperwork, though his shaking hands betrayed his nerves. While they waited, Melania turned to Barron. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, her demeanor shifting in an instant from commanding to maternal. Barron nodded, offering her a small smile. "I'm fine," he replied, "but thank you for coming." Melania gave his arm a reassuring squeeze before turning her attention back to the counter. The other clients in the lobby, who had been watching the entire scene unfold, began whispering among themselves. Some looked sympathetic, others intrigued, but all seemed captivated by the quiet drama playing out before them. Minutes later, Sandra returned, trailing behind a middle-aged man in a gray suit who looked flustered but determined to smooth things over. His name tag identified him as Michael L., branch manager. "Mrs. Trump," he began, extending a hand that Melania didn't take. "I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience. Please, let's step into my office to discuss this." Melania didn't move. "What needs to be discussed is the behavior of your staff," she said firmly. "My son came here to open an account and was met with ridicule and disrespect. Tell me, is this how you train your employees to treat potential clients?" Michael's face turned pale. "Of course not," he stammered. "This is unacceptable. I assure you we'll take immediate action." Melania raised an eyebrow. "Immediate action?" she repeated, her tone skeptical. "I hope that means more than empty promises." Michael nodded hastily. Absolutely. I'll handle this personally. Please, allow me to make this right. Melania studied him for a moment before finally nodding. Good, because if I ever hear of this happening again, I will ensure that everyone involved is held accountable, including you. Michael swallowed hard, nodding again. Understood. As the confrontation came to a close, the staff's faces were etched with shame and regret. They had underestimated Barron, judged him based on their own biases, and now found themselves facing the consequences of their actions. But the lesson wasn't over yet. Melania had one final message to deliver before leaving the bank. The room remained tense as Melania turned her gaze back to Sandra and Kyle, who were now visibly shaken. Their earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by the realization that their actions had not only been unprofessional, but had potentially jeopardized their positions. Melania took a deliberate step closer to the counter, her voice steady but firm. Respect is not something you selectively offer based on appearances or assumptions, she said, her words directed at the entire room. It is a reflection of your character, not the status of the person standing in front of you. Sandra's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the counter, while Kyle looked down at his desk, avoiding eye contact entirely. Melania's presence was magnetic, and her words carried the weight of experience and authority. The clients who had been quietly observing were now nodding in silent agreement, their expressions reflecting a mix of admiration and approval. You never know who is standing before you, Melania continued, her voice growing softer but no less impactful. Whether it's my son or someone without a famous last name, every individual deserves to be treated with dignity. Barron, standing quietly by her side, glanced at her with a hint of pride. He had grown used to the scrutiny and assumptions that came with his family name, but his mother's unwavering defense of him in this moment reminded him of the values she had always instilled in him: respect, grace, and standing up for what's right. Michael, the branch manager, stepped forward, eager to diffuse the tension further. Mrs. Trump, please allow us to make this right, he said, his tone earnest. We'll ensure this never happens again. And Mr. Trump, we would be honored to assist you in opening your account today. Melania gave him a pointed look, her expression softening only slightly. See that you do, she replied. Turning to Barron, she asked, would you like to proceed? Barron hesitated, glancing briefly at Sandra and Kyle. They looked utterly defeated, their earlier confidence reduced to nothing. He then turned back to his mother, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Yes, he said simply. As Michael personally escorted Barron to his office, Melania turned one last time to address the staff. Let this be a lesson, she said, her voice carrying across the room. Never underestimate someone based on your own assumptions. It's a mistake you won't want to repeat. With that, she followed Barron, leaving Sandra and Kyle standing in stunned silence. The other employees exchanged uneasy glances, and the clients began murmuring among themselves. The entire bank seemed to exhale all at once, the tension finally breaking. But even as the doors to the manager's office closed, the weight of the lesson lingered in the air, a reminder that respect and humility should never be optional. Inside the manager's office, the atmosphere was quieter but no less reflective. Barron sat across from Michael, who meticulously reviewed the paperwork, his hands still slightly unsteady. Melania stood nearby, her composed demeanor unbroken as she observed the process. Despite the earlier tension, her presence now felt less like a confrontation and more like a lesson being imparted. As Michael handed Barron a pen to sign the final document, he hesitated for a moment, looking up at the manager. Barron's voice was calm but deliberate. I hope this is a learning experience for everyone, he said, Because how you treat people says more about you than it does about them. Michael nodded, his expression sincere. You're absolutely right, he admitted. And I'm deeply sorry for the way you were treated today. It won't happen again. Barron finished signing the paperwork, then stood and extended a hand. Michael took it, his grip firm, though it was clear he felt the weight of the moment. Melania offered a small nod of approval before turning to leave with her son. As they exited the office, the lobby seemed to have transformed. The once dismissive staff now avoided eye contact, their postures tense with embarrassment. The other clients, who had witnessed the entire ordeal, offered subtle nods and encouraging smiles as Barron and Melania walked toward the exit. Just before stepping out, Melania paused. She turned back to the staff, her gaze sweeping across the room. Today was about more than just an account, she said. It was about integrity. Remember that the next time someone walks through those doors. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out with Barron by her side. The glass doors closed behind them, leaving a bank full of staff and clients reflecting on what they had just witnessed. Outside, the black SUV waited, its driver stepping out to open the door for them. As Barron climbed in, he turned to his mother. You didn't have to do all that, he said with a small smile, though his tone carried a note of gratitude. Melania smiled softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. It's not just about you, she said. It's about teaching people to do better, for themselves and for others. The SUV pulled away, leaving the bank and its staff behind. But the impact of the encounter lingered long after they were gone. For Sandra and Kyle, it was a stark reminder of the dangers of prejudice and the importance of treating every individual with respect, regardless of their appearance or assumptions about their worth. This story isn't just about Barron or Melania. It's about all of us. It's a reminder that our actions and words matter, especially when dealing with others. Judging someone based on appearances or preconceived notions not only hurts them but reveals our own shortcomings. The lesson here is simple. Treat everyone with dignity, because you never know the story behind the face standing in front of you.